So anyway, welcome to the presentation on abolishing the Electoral College. It is a critical issue for our country, and this presentation will give you some background and the reasons why the League of Women Voters supports a direct popular vote to elect our president and vice president. We'll start by sharing the basics. What is the Electoral College, and what is the League of Women Voters' position on this method of electing our president? Next, we'll show the problems caused by the Electoral College, problems that a direct popular vote would easily solve. Then we'll review the top arguments given in favor of the Electoral College and why each of those reasons are actually based on common myths. Finally, we'll explain what needs to be done to abolish the Electoral College, an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and what you can do now to help make that happen. And we'll do this with plenty of time left to answer your questions. Feel free to take your take-home quiz as we go, and please jot down your questions too, so you can ask them at the end of the presentation. Also, there's a blue card there, and I'll tell you what that's for a little bit later. First of all, the Electoral College is not a school. It isn't a building or a place. It's a group of 538 people who elect the president and vice president of the United States every 4 years. According to the U.S. Constitution, each state legislature gets to decide how their electors will be chosen. In the beginning of our country, state legislatures just picked the electors themselves. Over time, states started choosing electors by popular vote within their states. Each political party has their own slate of electors. When you vote in November, you are not voting directly for a presidential candidate. You are voting for a group of state electors from the candidate's political party who have pledged to give their electoral votes to the candidate. Some states actually have the electors on the ballot. We don't. Each state gets a specific number of electors based on their congressional delegation. One elector for each U.S. senator and for each U.S. representative. For example, Texas has 38 electoral votes in 2020, while Rhode Island has 4. The District of Columbia, although not a state, has 3. Importantly, the winner of the Electoral College is not whoever gets the most electoral votes. The winner must have a majority of the votes, over 50% of the votes to win. Currently, that's 270 electoral votes to win. If no candidate gets 270 votes, the U.S. House of Representatives chooses the president, with each state having just 1 vote, and the Senate chooses the vice president. Historically, and these are my slides, historically there have been attempts to abolish the Electoral College. Hundreds of them, by the way. I found a really good book about it, so you keep going. There's some more that are, I think, pretty interesting in our lifetime. Since 1970, the League's position has been that direct popular voting method for electing the president and vice president is essential to representative government. The League of Women Voters believes, therefore, that the Electoral College should be abolished. The rest of this presentation will explain the many problems with the Electoral College that the League has identified. You may have heard some of these problems, but there are also some that you may not have heard very much about. So let's jump into what's wrong with the Electoral College and how a direct popular vote for president will solve each and every one of these problems. So why was the Electoral College created? One big reason is slavery. The Electoral College was a compromise designed to give Southern states more voting power in presidential elections based on counting each enslaved person as 3/5 of a free person. This 3/5 compromise had already been used to increase the number of representatives given to the Southern states in the U.S. House of Representatives. Because the Electoral College is based in part on the number of members that each state has in the U.S. Congress, it carried this infamous map into the presidential elections. This rift between North and South was not because there were more people living in the northern states than in the southern states. In fact, as you can see from this chart, The northern and southern states had essentially the same total population in the late 1700s, about 1.8 million people each. However, the southern states had a much smaller voting population than the northern states because over a third of the southern states' population was enslaved. As a result, the southern states adamantly refused a direct popular vote for president. Before the convention, everyone expected that there would be battles between smaller and larger populated states. But as Madison wrote about halfway through the convention, it seems now to be pretty well understood that the real difference of interest lies not between the large and small, but between the northern and southern states. The institution of slavery and its consequences form the line of discrimination. If the racism of the Electoral College had ended when slavery ended, we might not be having this conversation. But the Electoral College continued to silence Black voters into the Civil War. Right after the Civil War, there was a brief period called Reconstruction, when federal troops were stationed in the South to enforce the newly won civil rights of formerly enslaved Americans. During Reconstruction, Black men voted, and the first Black representatives served in Congress. But then came the election of 1876, which was just a mess. Records are a bit murky, but it's pretty clear that Samuel J. Tilden won the popular vote for president over Rutherford B. Hayes. However, there were allegations of voter fraud in 4 states, Florida, North Carolina, Louisiana, and Oregon, both sides claiming victory. As a result, Tilden didn't get a majority in the Electoral College. So the 2 states came up with a compromise that traded, or the 2 parties came up with a compromise that traded the newly awarded rights of the Black people to shore up the malfunctioning Electoral College. This compromise allowed Hayes to become president in exchange for the removal of federal troops from the South. The states of the former Confederacy were once again allowed to rule themselves, and they started passing a series of laws commonly known as Jim Crow laws. During the Jim Crow era, the voting rights of Black people were systematically destroyed by state laws and local ordinances like poll taxes and literacy taxes. The Jim Crow era lasted for almost 100 years until the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So the Electoral College was created because of slavery, and the failure of the Electoral College in 1876 allowed racism to flourish. Unfortunately, the racist impact of the Electoral College didn't end with the Voting Rights Act. The Electoral College continues to suppress the voice of Black Americans. That's because states with a higher percentage of Black residents tend to have less power in the Electoral College, while states with whiter populations tend to have more power. For this analysis, Electoral College power is defined as the number of people it takes within a state for each electoral vote. If it takes fewer people to make up one electoral vote, the electoral power is strong. For example, in the chart at left, in states that are more than 85% white, it's about 400,000 people per electoral vote. And in states that are more than 50% Black, it's almost 650,000 people per electoral vote. If you do the math, 644,656 divided by 398,887, that means it takes 1.6 votes in states with high Black populations to equal 1 vote in states with higher white populations. This is a simple analysis based on the 2020 census data. However, a more sophisticated statistical analysis was done by William Black of the University of Maryland in 2019, and it came to the same conclusion. His analysis of every election from 2000 on indicates that the Electoral College has consistently awarded more votes per capita to states with whiter populations. Again, the Electoral College may not be trying to mute Black votes, but it is having that impact simply because of how our Black and white populations are distributed across the states. Perhaps this will naturally reduce over time, but a direct popular vote would immediately eliminate this racist impact by making every voter count as 1 vote, regardless of race or any other demographic. So I'm a mathematician. I have to, so I went out on the web. This is my stuff. Look at the counties with the largest Black populations in the U.S. One of the interesting things I found is that Texas has changed dramatically. It was 20%. The state had a 20% Black population in 1960. It's down to 12% now. That was very interesting. And here is a very interesting metric that really, I think pretty well, it's letting you see the power of votes, even though the numbers like don't make, it's that 13 electoral votes for 5 million capita. There's not 5 million capita in Washington, but it lets you see the power of the vote with whole numbers, not fractions. So you can see here, here's all these states. And here's the power numbers here. The other thing I'm going to point out, and if anybody wants to look at this map later, I think it's very interesting because it points to, there's some other interests in some of those larger number states that I think we could look at. But next slide.
Are they counting cows in Wyoming?
There are, because there are 2 representatives and maybe 3 now, I think 2 representatives and a senator, and so few people that if I take the number of, if I pretend that there are 5 million people in Wyoming, they would have 26 representatives at that rate. Does that idea make sense?
Yes.
If there happened to be 5 million, they would get 26 representatives. Okay, well, West Virginia gets 14. So I did some number crunching, and I did it very, very conservatively, because when I looked at what the League of Women Voters did, I thought, it's hard to do these numbers, and I want to see whether I take kind of this harder tack and find out that I still find that they have the same thing, and I did in the end. So what I did here was just take I took the talk really loud. Okay, I got to talk really loud. Okay.
This is the microphone.
Microphone's here. Okay. So the actual percentage of population in the whole United States is Black is 13.6% in 2020. These are 2020 numbers. So I took the states and I divided them with those who had less than 13.6 Black folks in their population, percentage of Black folks, and those with greater than 13.6. The League of Women Voters chose 15. By making an arbitrary choice like that, me, the statistician, thinks, I don't know. Why did they choose that number? Does it give them better results? Never mind. So I chose that. And then because it was easier to work with these really nice whole numbers, I used the electoral votes per 5 million capita per state. And I still came out with, if you have a smaller Black population, you have more power. Your state has more power with its electoral votes. Okay, can we finish? Yeah, I think we should finish the math, right? Okay, a lot of people these days are not aware of the racism that's been part of the Electoral College from the beginning, yet they are aware of other issues with the system. So what do most people dislike about the Electoral College? The problem we hear most from people is that the Electoral College turns losers into winners. 5 times in our history, the Electoral College has awarded the presidency to candidates who lost the popular vote. This happened 3 times in the 1800s and twice in the century in 2016 and in the year 2000. A direct popular vote for president would ensure that the candidate who gets the most votes from the people would actually become the president. All of us went to high school between here and here. I picked up a book at the library that reminds me of what I learned about the Electoral College in high school, which is it was there to guarantee that the person who won the popular vote really had a majority of the states behind him too. So it would actually assist the popular vote winner and make us accept the results of the election better. And I do have a book from the library I'm going to take it and show to our librarians. It's written in 1992, and the first sentence in the introduction says almost exactly that. And I don't remember hearing about these other three when I was in school. When there had ever been a time that there was a difference between the Electoral College and the next. Another problem is that the Electoral College violates the principle of one person, one vote. It makes some votes count more than others depending on where the voter happens to live. That's because the number of electoral votes given to a state isn't exactly proportional to its population. No matter how many people live in a state, it gets 2 electoral votes based on its 2 senators. So votes from smaller states have their votes weighted more heavily in the Electoral College than votes from larger states. For example, you can see in the table on the left that 1 vote in Wyoming counts as much as almost 4 votes in Florida. Wyoming has 3 electoral votes, or 1 electoral vote for every 192,000 people. Florida is a bigger state, and it has 29 electoral votes. That's 1 electoral vote for every 743,000 people in Florida. So if you do the math, in the Electoral College, it takes nearly 4 popular votes in Florida to equal 1 popular vote in Wyoming. This plays out in other small and large state matchups like Wyoming, Vermont, and Alaska, whose electoral votes count as much as 3 or 4 times in the states like Florida, Texas, and California. A fundamental principle of the United States is that 1 person has 1 vote. This is the standard for every other election in the country, and it should be 1 person, 1 vote in our presidential election. And that's exactly how it would be in a direct popular vote for president. Regardless of how votes are weighted in the Electoral College, we all know by now that only a few states really matter in presidential elections. These are so-called swing states, where the outcome of the vote is considered to be up for grabs. The rest of the states are considered safe states, where the feeling is that the election result is obvious. By the way, when I was campaigning about a year ago, I talked to many people who didn't vote because their vote didn't matter. It's probably the most common thing I heard. I'm not voting. I already threw it away. Doesn't matter. The map here shows the swing states from the 2020 election. The top 6 swing states are in dark purple: Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Florida. Then there were another 7 swing states shown in lighter purple. Together, these swing states got almost all the TV ads and campaign events. In fact, 100% of the TV ads and 98% of campaign events for the 2020 general election or the presidential campaign were in these states. They get all of the candidates' attention, and even worse, that means that they have much greater influence over candidates' policy positions. Has anyone seen a presidential ad on TV in our local area? I'm getting them sent to me on Facebook. We're not going to get those ads. They won't come here. We're not a swing state. We're 3/5 blue.
I've seen them on TV, but they were rebroadcast.
Oh,
They'd show the ad, but we don't get that.
right. So you get them in a newscast because they're showing the ad to discuss the ad. Yeah. With direct election by popular vote, candidates would be forced to pay attention to the whole country, not just a handful of swing states. All 50 states and the District of Columbia would require consideration from presidential candidates. You can really see what happens there. I love this graph. So in 2016, the swing states saw 7% more votes show up. The safe states had 6% fewer voters show up. And I think that is, anyway, the Electoral College not only makes some votes matter more than others, it gives people a reason not to vote. It actually decreases voter turnout in so-called safe states. Data from 2016 and 2020 prove this. In the graph, you can see that the percentage of eligible voters who cast a vote for president were significantly lower in safe states compared to the swing states. These differences may seem small, but only 6 or 7 percentage points. But that translates to 15 million registered votes in non-swing states who choose not to vote in 2016, and it translated to 22 million registered voters who chose not to vote in 2020. That's more than enough to change the outcome of the presidential election. This is not a partisan issue, affecting both major political parties. If I'm a Republican voter in a blue state or a Democratic voter in a red state, I feel like my vote for president never counts. So why bother? On the flip side, Republican voters in red states and Democratic voters in blue states feel like their party doesn't really need their vote. So millions of people just don't vote. A direct popular vote for president will increase voter turnout by making every vote count and count equally. As we saw in the 2020 election and its aftermath, the Electoral College also leaves our presidential election more vulnerable to manipulation and even outright fraud. The Electoral College provides partisan operatives with a roadmap for overturning election results. In 2020, that created a desire to find 38 electoral votes instead of over 3.5 million votes if the winner were chosen by popular vote. And the Electoral College showed where it would be easiest to gain those electoral votes by finding fewer than 43,000 ballots in just 3 states, Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. That's all it would have taken to overturn the results of the 2020 election for president. So in preparing this, I had a great pause. I remember reading the 12th Amendment because I read all the amendments, like you probably read all the amendments someplace in your high school civics class. But I didn't remember this. But what if on January 6th of 2021, the House had thrown out some of the electors, say those 3 states? Because remember, they were coming up with some alternate, and if we had just set them aside and said, we're not going to count them, what would have happened right away? Well, let's read what the law says. So this is the first part. If the president, and there's a lot there. So you're president if you have the most electoral votes. But what happens if you have 270 electoral votes? And if no person has such majority of those electoral votes, then from the persons having the highest numbers not exceeding 3 on the list of those voted for as president, in other words, the top 3 candidates, the House of Representatives shall choose when? Immediately, by ballot, the president. And then the rest of it is you need 2/3 of the people there, and it has to be a majority vote of those House of Representatives. They also had till March 14th to do this because they weren't all in Washington, D.C. when the votes were counted on January 6th in the past, but they were in 2020. And I don't know about you, but I've seen so much misreading of the law and taking parts of the law out of context that when I read this, I just, anyway. So I don't like the way that this could be used. But that's me. That's not the League of Women Voters. I can go back onto their presentation. After outlining all of these problems with the Electoral College, we hear from some folks who say, even if all of this is true, here's why the Electoral College still makes sense. We'd like to walk through the most common reasons why some people continue to support the Electoral College. These are not just fringe theories. By the way, these are the main points that supporters of the Electoral College use to defend the undemocratic system. And none of them stand up under scrutiny. They are actually myths that do not stand up to the facts. So let's bust these myths now. Myth number 1. Without the Electoral College, our presidents would all be chosen by a couple of big states like California and New York. Go ahead and put that again. We decided to run through some numbers to see what a direct popular vote would look like. The first thing we notice is that both Texas and Florida are larger than New York. Second, we could see that every state has a mixture of Republican and Democratic voters. So for instance, we're 3-2 in Oregon. There's never a time that Oregon's been 100% Democrat or 100% Republican. With this in mind, we then zeroed in on how many states it realistically takes to win the popular vote. I guess just keep clicking, there we go. Here are the popular votes per state for Barack Obama in 2012, starting with California on the left and adding the Obama votes from each state. In 2012, Obama had to get over 63 million votes to win the direct popular vote. And you can see that votes from 39 states were needed to get him there. That's a large majority of states, not just a few. It is simply mathematically impossible for an election by popular vote to be determined by just the largest states. The fact is that direct election by popular vote means that votes from most or all states would be needed to win the presidency, and every vote would count and count the same, no matter where the voter lived. After seeing the facts about states, believers in the Electoral College will then bring up a similar myth, that without the Electoral College, our presidents would all be chosen by just a few big cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. Once again, statistics tell a different story. These pie charts show the percentage of voting age adults who live in cities. As soon as as seen on the first chart on the left, the combined voting age population of New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago is just 5% of the national voting age population. That's certainly not enough to decide an election. So they took the top 10 biggest cities next, and they got to 8%. The top 50 largest cities are 15%, and Rome is 14%. Awfully close, isn't it? Most of us are in smaller towns and suburbs. That's about the sum. There just aren't enough people living in big cities to decide our presidential election on their own. Most people in this country live in small towns and suburban areas. It is simply mathematically impossible for an election by popular vote to be determined by just the largest states or just the largest cities. Once again, direct election by popular vote would ensure that every person is equally represented, regardless of where they live. Myth number 3. Abolishing the Electoral College will only benefit Democratic candidates. To bust this myth, let's look at the 2004 presidential election, the Bush-Kerry election. On the left is the Electoral College map for the 2004 election, where George W. Bush won over John Kerry with 3 million more popular votes than Kerry. The map on the right, shows how close George W. Bush came to winning the popular vote, but losing the Electoral College. Can you spot the difference? Where's the difference? Just one state. Michigan. Michigan, okay. But right below Michigan, a little east. Ohio. If John Kerry had received only 119,000 more votes, which isn't much in Ohio, he would have won the Electoral College and the election, even though Bush would still have had nearly 3 million more popular votes. The fact is that the Electoral College can hurt either of our two major political parties. This is not a partisan issue. Perhaps the biggest obstacle to eliminating the Electoral College is just plain pessimism. Are you with me? Many people feel that the Electoral College will never be abolished because it would take a constitutional amendment to do that. It's never going to happen, is a comment we hear all too often. What we need to defeat is defeatism. Here's a timeline showing the dates that all constitutional amendments were ratified. The Bill of Rights is shown from just one bar. You can see that our history includes flurries of constitutional activity punctuated by long periods of inactivity. There was a period of 60 years between the first two clubs, then another gap of 43 years. There were 18 years between the amendments of the 1930s and those of the 1950s and 60s, then a gap of 21 years to the 27th Amendment in 1992. It's been 30 years since then. What distinguishes these periods of constitutional activity They tended to be periods of great national political activity, where citizens were feeling that our democracy was in crisis, where the demand for change across our society was persistent and loud. There was the period after the Civil War, the progressive era at the turn of the last century, and the civil rights era in the 50s and 60s. It seems to be in the middle of another period. We seem to be in the middle of another period of political activity, of demand for change. Only time will tell, but the level of engagement we are seeing now and the genuine concerns about the resilience of our democracy are remarkable. Now let's focus on our goal, abolishing the Electoral College by amending the Constitution. What will it take to get there? Our ultimate goal is a constitutional amendment to abolish the Electoral College and use a direct popular vote to elect our president. This is how we amend the Constitution. First, a bill to propose an amendment needs to pass both the U.S. House and the Senate by a 2/3 majority. That's not easy, nor should it be. Then, the proposed amendment needs to be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislature. That's 38 states. Again, not easy, but it's been done 27 times. We can do it again. Please note that it doesn't require, and the League doesn't support, a constitutional convention to accomplish this. The usual amendment process outlined here would do the job of abolishing the Electoral College. Right now, there are, I believe it's 17 states who have already agreed that if they come into that 38 states, that they will send their electors to the person, choose the electors to the person who wins the national vote, not just their state vote, but wins the national election. Where do you think Oregon stands on that? Are we in or out?
Oh,
I don't know. We'll have to go. Are we one of the people that say that we'll give our votes to the?
I don't think so. I think it's been proposed a couple times, but it's never moved out of committee.
Yeah. Okay. Congress took action between 1969 and 1970 to abolish the Electoral College. There was a ton of momentum at the time because in the 1968 election, a third-party candidate, some of us remember him well, George Wallace, got 46 votes in the Electoral College. Both Democrats and Republicans were worried that Wallace's popularity could have resulted with neither Richard Nixon nor Hewitt Humphrey getting the required 270 votes in the Electoral College to win the election. A Gallup poll at the time shows a whopping 81% of Americans supporting abolishing the Electoral College. And a bill to amend the Constitution passed the House of Representatives by a huge bipartisan margin of 338 to 70. However, the bill died in the Senate when it was filibustered by Southern Democrats, who feared that their states would lose power in presidential elections because of their traditionally low voter turnout. Similar bills have been introduced as recently as 2021, but there has been no vote on these bills. We believe this issue lacks momentum because of the defeatist attitude that it's never going to happen. So that's what we need to change. We need momentum. The League of Women Voters is uniquely positioned to empower voters through education and advocacy at the local, state, and national levels. This is what we do. We engage with voters, provide them with the information, educate them, and the education they need about elections and issues. And then, armed with this education, the League can activate voters to bring this momentum to Congress when the time is right. What can you do now? 3 things: organize, educate, and advocate. As a local league, we can organize by choosing a league member to coordinate with the League's task force to abolish the Electoral College. So I'm new here. Do we have a league member who's coordinating with the national on the direct? vote in abolishing the electoral college.
The reason for break right now.
And we're almost
Sure.
done.
Oh,
Yeah, we're
okay.
almost done. Yeah.
I nominate Charlotte to be that.
Uh-oh.
All in favor, say aye.
No. Nobody seconded it, so we're gonna go. No. So then we need to register and coordinate with the national to receive updates and supports from the League of Women Voter Task Force. We can also start to identify local or state allies, community leaders, activists, and legislators. And that's why I gave you this blue sheet. People in our community who support a direct popular vote for president. And please, and also please maintain a contact list for action alerts about abolishing the electoral college when issued by the League of Women Voters. And I think I was supposed to say that on the next slide because it's also about educating. So where in our community can we show up with this information? Who wants to know? Who would be interested? The number one most important thing we do is educate. Educate ourselves, educate others. The League of Women Voters Task Force will be offering education, electoral college 101 training for League members and allies. Okay, I'm going to go to that. Who else is going to go to that? Okay, yeah, that's right. Training for League members and allies. Please sign up if you'd like to learn more. With or without that training, you are encouraged to present this PowerPoint, the unedited version, so not the one I'm showing you right now, the unedited version everywhere you can. Reach out to your local civil and social groups, colleges and universities, anywhere there are people who are willing to listen and learn, and distribute our brochure everywhere you can. So that was what those blue cards are for. Yes, okay.
I just wanted to say that this is the first release from League of Women Voters, US.
Oh,
In other
no.
words,
That's why
it
we
was a secret moonshot
Oh,
until this came out.
Uh-huh.
And so that's why,
Okay.
but apparently it's no longer a secret.
I guess not. And I'll tell you, when I was going through this, it was very hard not to edit it and not to have my own voice. But so I'll work on that. Okay. So on those blue cards, I think get those to Kay probably for now. But if you think of where we can drop off brochures, what groups do you know of that would be interested in maybe hearing this information or a subset of it or something? Where else can we work at educating? Finally, momentum requires visible advocacy. Let everyone know that the full power of the League of Women Voters is fueling the effort to abolish the Electoral College and elect our president and vice president by direct popular vote. The League of Women Voters National has graphics and templates that we can download on the League management site. And we're excited to announce that the League will observe Abolish Electoral College Day on January 6th every year until we get this done. January 6th is the day that Congress meets to count the Electoral College votes. And it was the day in 2021 that our Capitol was attacked in an attempt to overturn that vote. We are going to turn January 6th into a day of peaceful civic education about the Electoral College. Please watch for action alerts around this. So they gave themselves a year to get that one done. And next slide. Well, thank you for your attention. I hope your quizzes are coming along. I'd like to open this up to questions, and I'm not the only one here who can answer these questions. I know Abigail is getting involved, and others probably have too in looking at the Electoral College. I have a couple of good books to recommend, a couple that I don't recommend, one I want to see pulled off the library shelves. So any question, Alice?
Thanks to the interwebs, I can tell you that Oregon is a part of the National Popular Vote.
Yep, and I thought, yeah.